Welcome to Business Innovators Radio, featuring industry influencers and trendsetters sharing proven strategies to help you build a better life right now.
Hello, listeners. This is your host, Andy Curry, and I am fired up, let me tell you, because I have Natalie Holder on the line with me. Natalie's got quite the background. She has been speaking professionally for 8 years. Natalie's also an employment lawyer. She's still got her license, and I assume practicing. And the content she speaks on centers around the workplace, which we'll get to in here shortly. Natalie speaks primarily in the U.S., but has spoken internationally as well. She is based out of Connecticut, and she has written 2 books. The first one is called Exclusion, Strategies for Increasing Diversity in Recruitment, Retention, and Promotion. Her second book is called Recruiting and Retaining a Diverse Workforce, New Rules for a New Generation. Natalie, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Andy.
We are very happy to have you with us today, so thank you for joining us. Let's talk about your speaking gigs. Now, who is it you're speaking to? What are you teaching them? How are you helping them?
I typically work with companies, government agencies, law firms, and academic institutions that are trying to find ways to increase diversity and inclusion within their workplaces. Today, there's a great conversation around unconscious bias, and that's typically where I catch many of these organizations on the continuum. So, when I think about diversity and inclusion, it's really a continuum and not just a destination. It has various stops along the way. The more junior level and more entry level areas of diversity and inclusion focus on, buying tickets at different organizational events that do focus on diversity and inclusion, sponsorship of events. It's really not about bringing D&I into the organization. The next few phases on the organizational continuum look at bringing in conversations around how do we think and how do we interact with others who we may perceive to be different from us. And then when you go a little bit further on the continuum, you start looking at, how is it that our unconscious biases and our micro inequities do impact workplace relationships, and how does it ultimately affect the bottom line of the organization? So really tying in diversity and inclusion into financial impact, that's where I meet most organizations on the diversity continuum.
Now, when you say inclusion, define that so the listeners understand what you mean by that.
Sure. So I like to use this analogy when I think of the difference between diversity and inclusion. So think back to when you were in high school. You had a lunch time, and you probably had a group of people who you sat with at the lunch table. Imagine that one day you had to sit at a different lunch table because all of your friends were not at lunch that day. So you ask, can I sit at this table? And people say, sure, you can sit here. However, as you're sitting at the table, no one's really talking to you. Everyone's making plans for the weekend, but no one's inviting you. The difference between diversity and inclusion is that diversity is being invited to the table, but inclusion is being engaged while you're at the table. So inclusion is that aspect of the workplace and where someone is invited to the key meeting, where someone is not being left off of key email chains, and where someone is able to voice their thoughts and opinions without feeling as though they're going to be crushed, because once again, they're looked at as being a valuable member of the organization.
How did you get into this?
I was a labor and employment attorney initially, and while practicing employment law, I noticed around 2002, 2003, many of the cases that came before me, these were cases that definitely had a stench of unfairness and inequity within them. However, under the employment laws, you cannot discriminate against someone based on a protected class. However, you can mistreat someone in the workplace and fire them if the reason is not based on a protected class. I know that's probably blowing your listeners' mind, but it's actually the truth. In most workplaces and where you don't have an employment contract, if you're an at-will employee, your employer can actually get rid of you for any reason, once again, as long as it's not based on your protected classes. Protected classes are race, gender, national origin, disability, age, and so on. And so many of the cases that came before me were instances where people were taken off of a leadership track and where people's careers were being sidelined by someone who didn't like them, where there was a personal vendetta. But these were not actionable cases because I couldn't point to a protected class. I could point to poor leadership and poor management. But believe it or not, poor leadership and poor management are not actionable under the law. In that case, many supervisors would find themselves in courtrooms. So out of this frustration of watching many of my potential clients being turned away all because I couldn't find a protected class under which I could litigate their claims, I started thinking about this very new era that we're venturing into and where people are still feeling as though they were marginalized. However, it wasn't based on anything overt or any unfairness that was overt based on a protected class. So I started doing a lot of research, and I came across this term called micro-inequities. Micro-inequities are the subtle gestures and the subtle kinesthetics that let a person know that they're either included or excluded from a group.
Such
the term
as?
was founded, for instance, a micro-inequity might be if I'm sitting in a meeting with you and you start looking at your watch. What impression does that give you?
I'm boring you and you don't want to listen to me.
Exactly. Even though I haven't said it, my body language is saying that you're not valuable at this time.
Right.
During many of my sessions, I do this exercise called I Can Silence You Without Saying a Word. And within usually a good 20 to 30 seconds, when I start looking at my watch and I start engaging a number of different other micro-inequities, like starting to play with my Apple phone, starting to play with papers and shuffling them around, doing anything but listening to this person. The individual stops talking. And I ask them why, and they say, well, because you weren't paying attention to me. And that's the power of micro-inequities. They have the power to reduce our confidence and to silence us in many organizations. And it was a term that was founded by Professor Margaret Rowe at MIT. And the very powerful thing about micro-inequities that struck me was that you can't file a grievance against them or a lawsuit.
That is interesting. Now, you've got clients coming to you, and there's a lot you couldn't do, so you got interested in trying to figure out how to help people with this.
And
right?
creating some education around how is our behavior impacting other people. Because I think that most people are well-minded. Most people don't actually go to work to, create strife for others and to derail other people's careers. Most of us don't, start out in our workplaces like that. However, our conduct oftentimes does land that way with individuals on our teams. And so in an effort to increase camaraderie, collegiality, and an understanding of how we are impacting each other, I started getting into training groups and organizations on micro-inequities. And that eventually evolved into bigger and more robust conversations around unconscious bias.
Okay. So who's the last group you spoke to?
So the last group that I spoke to actually was an entertainment company. And it was an entertainment company in where there was an individual who used a very disparaging word toward an ethnic group. And so they asked me to come in to provide them with, the foundational compliance training, the training that I call the, do's and don'ts of the workplace, just reinforcing and helping their staff understand what our employment laws do, what they do and don't allow. And the very tricky part about an entertainment company like this was that the music that this entertainment company produces actually uses the word that this staff member used to one of his colleagues. So I had a very, very interesting conversation with them, helping them to understand the difference between the artistic and creative aspects of their workplaces versus the actual content and substance of their workplaces. So if they're creating content, sure, listening to the music that is currently being played in the marketplace is fine. However, using that language toward one of your coworkers, that's not protected under the law.
This sounds like kind of a new area of law, or not very old at least. Is that correct?
I'd say that it's becoming more nuanced. For ages, and I wouldn't say ages. I think you're right that it is somewhat of a new area because if you think about it, the anti-discrimination laws have only been around since 1964. Last year, we just celebrated, 50 years of Title VII. And that's not a long time, given that our country's been founded for hundreds of years. So you're right. All of these laws are somewhat new, and they're evolving, particularly as we're starting to see more and more diversity in our workplaces, more women, more people of color, more people from the LGBT community, more people with disabilities. And as a result, organizations are struggling to find a way to make sure that we're all working well together under one.
Now, in lieu of what's going on around the world with the Islamic stuff, are you finding people of with that kind of a background in the workplace, are they having more trouble, or have you run across that?
I must say that most people are very astute, and they understand the difference between extremist Islam and your everyday garden variety neighbor who happens to be a follower of Islam, someone who is Muslim. And so the good thing is that in most workplaces, you don't have the name calling, you don't have the attacks or any sort of mistreatment of people with or people from the Islamic community. However, the Supreme Court recently decided a case involving a young woman who applied for a job at Abercrombie & Fitch, and she was wearing the headdressing of a woman who practices Islam, and she applied for this position and wasn't hired for the position because her head covering was not considered to be a part of the dress code. Now, under the law, you must provide a reasonable accommodation for an employee under two circumstances: A, disability, and B, religious accommodation. And the accommodation basically is the employer's interactive exchange with the employee to figure out how can we make this work. It's not just simply a smackdown and saying, oh, well, we can't provide this accommodation because it doesn't fit our dress code. It's a matter of talking to the employee and figuring out how can we make this work. Is there a safety violation? Is there a reason why this head dressing is going to get in the way of our employees being able to identify, our customers being able to identify our employees? That's the conversation that Abercrombie should have been having, but they didn't. They flat out denied this woman employment. The Supreme Court actually decided in this young woman's favor and said that Abercrombie should have provided her, or at least had the conversation around religious accommodation of her head dressing.
Interesting. Boy, that's a lot of arguable points on both sides, isn't it?
Oftentimes it is, and that's the reason why. These issues do oftentimes get. That's the reason why these issues oftentimes do make it to court, because they're not simple and easy issues to hash out between two parties.
Right. So how did you get into the speaking business then?
So I actually was at the right place at the right time. When I left my law firm, I knew that I wanted to work with corporations and help them understand the diversity and inclusion studies that I was working on. I wanted to focus my work on the training and development side of employment law. And, silly me, however, I really thought that 100% or 90% of my work at least would be diversity and inclusion. But it turned out that the majority of my work was actually compliance. You mentioned a very interesting fact about me earlier, and you said that I still have my law license. And most people would wonder, well, why does someone who doesn't practice law anymore still have a law license? Why would someone who is on the training and development side of employment law, why is that person still a member of the bar? Reason being is that I have the credibility of an attorney when I walk into different organizations that do require compliance education. And so I got into the speaking business because a major corporation was being sued for sexual harassment. One of their on-air personalities had allegedly sexually harassed another colleague in the newsroom. And in order to settle this lawsuit, the court required that this company have all of its employees across the nation undergo multiple years of sexual harassment prevention training. and that's where I came in. I was one of the attorneys who provided this training. And so much of my speaking is actually educating people about employment law and how to avoid the issues that do bring lawyers into your workplace.
Interesting. And it just kind of blossomed from there then. So did you instantly quit the law firm and just get speaking, or was it just kind of a slow get out of it process?
Well, before you make the leap, you definitely have to kind of slide into the new situation. So while I was still practicing law, I was, doing a lot of pro bono work and then small paid gigs. And then, technically my very first client was Time Warner. They brought me in to work with their Black Affinity group in providing an educational seminar about leadership and how diversity and inclusion often drives the leadership of an organization and how it can drive the leadership of an organization.
Okay, fascinating. Well, Natalie, how can people get a hold of you should they want to use your services, hear you speak, and that kind of thing?
Thank you so much for asking me that, Andy. They can reach me either out at my website, which is questdiversity.com, or you can give me a call at 1-800-897-0260.
Say that one more time. 800.
1-800-897-0260. And you can also follow me on Twitter, where I often do tweet about today's most salient issues in employment law and how they're impacting our workplaces. And my handle is at NVH315.
Okay. Well, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Andy, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to your audience. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Business Innovators Radio. To hear all episodes featuring leading industry influencers and trendsetters, visit us online at businessinnovatorsradio.com today.